It was 3:47 p.m. on Tuesday, September 15th, 1964, when the heavy, humid air of Harlem drifted into the Palm Cafe on 125th Street, trailing behind Officers Patrick Sullivan and James Kowalsski. They didn't come for the coffee. The two white officers moved with a practiced, heavy-footed arrogance, cutting through the low murmur of afternoon business like a blade. They stopped at the corner table where Bumpy Johnson sat, the undisputed king of the neighborhood, nursing a cigar and a quiet conversation with his associates. Without a word of greeting, Sullivan and Kowalski assumed the universal police posture of authority backed by potential violence. Feet shoulder-width apart, badges gleaming under the dim lights, and hands resting ominously on their service weapons. The clink of their utility belts was the only sound in the sudden silence that gripped the cafe. Sullivan's eyes were cold, fixed on Bumpy with a predatory glint that ignored the absence of any legal paperwork. They hadn't brought a warrant. They had brought an ultimatum. In the heart of Harlem, the message was clear. This wasn't a legal procedure. It was a display of raw, unbridled power designed to break the man who couldn't be broken. Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch as he let a slow plume of cigar smoke drift toward the ceiling. His eyes remained locked on Sullivan, his voice dropping to a calm, clinical tone that cut through the officer's bravado. He asked a single question that stripped away the pretense of the badge. "Which paycheck came in this week, Sullivan? Did Vincent Gigante pay you, or was it someone from City Hall?" The effect was instantaneous. Sullivan's face turned a violent, bruised red, his veins bulging against the collar of his uniform. The officer's professionalism shattered, replaced by a raw, ancestral hatred. He lunged forward, barking a jagged racial slur that echoed off the cafe's tiled walls, stripping away any illusion of law and order. He grabbed Bumpy's arm with a white-knuckled grip, attempting to jerk the crime boss upward with the full weight of his frustration. But Bumpy remained rooted like an oak. He didn't struggle or shout. He simply sat there, a mountain of quiet defiance. Sullivan pulled again, his boots scuffing the floor in a desperate, failing effort to move the man. It was a humiliating display, a supposedly powerful officer of the law proving he lacked the strength to move a single man without calling for help. The heavy, stagnant air of the cafe was pierced at precisely 3:49 p.m. by the arrival of Detective Marcus Thompson. As one of the few black detectives in the 28th Precinct, his presence carried a different kind of weight, one of cold, procedural steel. He didn't just walk in. He positioned himself with surgical precision between Sullivan and the exit, cutting off their line of retreat. "Officers, what is the basis for this arrest?" Thompson's voice was calm, yet it resonated in the sudden silence like a gavel. Sullivan, his hand still white-knuckled on Bumpy's arm, snarled a dismissal, but Thompson didn't budge. He demanded the warrant and the specific incident report for the alleged assault, his eyes unblinking. When the officers stammered that the paperwork was back at the precinct, Thompson dismantled their authority in front of the entire neighborhood. He spoke of probable cause and legal justification, his words transforming their badge-heavy intimidation into something ugly and illicit. "Without a warrant or evidence, this isn't an arrest," Thompson declared, his gaze hardening. "It's kidnapping under color of authority." Caught in the glare of a superior officer who actually knew the law, Sullivan's rage turned to a desperate, twitching caution. He released Bumpy's arm, the humiliation stinging worse than any blow, and backed away toward the door. The sun had barely dipped below the jagged Harlem skyline on September 16th when Officer James Kowalsski stepped out of the precinct, his mind heavy with the lingering humiliation of the Palm Cafe. As he reached for his car door in the dim light of the side street, the air around him suddenly thickened. 4 men emerged from the shadows like ink blots bleeding into paper, flanking him with a precision that signaled professional intent. There was no shouting, no frantic movement, only the heavy, rhythmic presence of men who had done this 100 times before. One of them stepped forward, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that offered Kowalski a crossroads. He was given a choice. He could come voluntarily and keep his dignity, or he could be forced, which would be a far messier affair for everyone involved. Kowalsski looked at the cold, steady eyes of the men surrounding him, and realized that his badge, which had felt like a shield only a day ago, was now nothing more than a target. He chose the quiet path. Without a word, he allowed himself to be guided into the back of a waiting sedan, vanishing into the night as the car began its long, silent trek toward a secluded warehouse in the Bronx. By the following evening, a cold sweat had settled over Officer Patrick Sullivan. The unexplained disappearance of his partner, Kowalsski, felt like a noose tightening around his own neck. Every shadow in Harlem seemed to be watching him as he drove toward the Triborough Bridge, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. As he reached the span of the bridge, the familiar flicker of emergency lights dancing against the steel girders offered a momentary surge of relief. A police checkpoint was ahead, safety, or so he thought. He slowed his vehicle, rolling down the window as two uniformed figures approached with flashlights cutting through the mist. The men moved with the stiff precision of the academy, their hats low, their badges catching the strobe of the flares. It wasn't until Sullivan looked into the eyes of the man reaching for his door that the relief turned into pure, ice-water terror. These weren't 28th Precinct men. The officers manning the roadblock were the same silent shadows that moved through Bumpy's world. Before Sullivan could reach for his service weapon or throw the car into reverse, the door was wrenched open. He was pulled from the seat with a violent efficiency, the very checkpoint he had trusted becoming the cage that swallowed him whole. Inside the cavernous silence of the Bronx warehouse, the smell of damp concrete and old motor oil hung heavy around Sullivan and Kowalsski. Stripped of their holsters and their pride, the two officers sat zip-tied to industrial chairs under the harsh, clinical glare of a single hanging bulb. Bumpy Johnson stood in the shadows just beyond the light, his voice a low, rhythmic purr that was far more terrifying than any shout. He didn't want their apologies. He wanted their ink. He placed legal pads and pens on a scarred wooden table before them, his instructions simple and absolute. Write until the truth matches the trouble you brought to my door. Initially, the officers clung to a crumbling wall of silence, but after a period of physical persuasion from Bumpy's silent associates, the dam broke. The sound of scratching pens filled the room as the officers' hands trembled across the paper. They didn't just admit to the Palm Cafe setup, they began to unravel the entire tapestry of the 28th Precinct. By the time the sun began to rise, the pads were filled with the names of 47 corrupt colleagues. Most damning of all, the name Vincent Gigante appeared 43 separate times, etched in the frantic, desperate handwriting of men who realized that Bumpy's mercy was the only thing standing between them and the dark. The following afternoon, in the quiet wood-paneled sanctuary of an office far removed from the grime of the warehouse, Bumpy Johnson sat across from his attorney, Theodore Green. Spread across the desk were the handwritten confessions, the ink still fresh enough to smear, yet heavy enough to sink a city. Green adjusted his spectacles, his eyes widening as he tallied the names of 47 officers. This wasn't just evidence of a local bribe, it was a blueprint of systemic decay. The air in the room grew thick with the realization of what they truly held. They weren't just looking at paper, they were looking at a nuclear option. Green noted that the frequent mention of Vincent Gigante, paired with the officers' admissions of specific payoffs, provided enough federal ammunition to send the Chin to prison for 2 decades. They held the detonator to the biggest police corruption scandal in New York history, a storm capable of washing away the leadership of the 28th Precinct and beyond. Bumpy watched Green's face, his own expression unreadable behind a veil of cigar smoke. He understood that while guns could kill men, this documentation could destroy an empire. The leverage was absolute, and for the first time, the law was finally on Bumpy Johnson's side. On the morning of September 18th, the heavy double doors of the 28th Precinct swung open, and the frantic energy of the station house died an instant, unnatural death. Bumpy Johnson walked through the entrance with a measured, regal stride, flanked by Theodore Green. He didn't skulk or hide. He moved directly toward the center of the room, his presence a dark, immovable force against the backdrop of blue uniforms. Telephones continued to ring unanswered, and the rhythmic clack of typewriters ceased as every officer in the room froze, their hands hovering over holsters and desks. The air was thick with a mixture of disbelief and hostility, but Bumpy ignored the glares, his eyes fixed on the hallway leading to the command offices. He approached the sergeant's desk and, in a voice that carried to the furthest corners of the precinct, demanded an immediate audience with Captain Morrison. He stated his purpose with a chilling, surgical clarity. He was there to discuss the current whereabouts of Officers Sullivan and Kowalsski. The implication hung in the silence like a live wire. By walking into the lion's den unarmed, Bumpy had signaled that he wasn't afraid of their cage because he already held the keys to their destruction. Behind the heavy oak door of the commander's office, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the unspoken desperation of a precinct in crisis. Captain Morrison sat rigid, his eyes darting between Bumpy Johnson and the stack of handwritten pages now resting on his desk. Bumpy leaned forward, his voice a calm, rhythmic contrast to the frantic ticking of the wall clock. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The documents spoke for him, screaming the names of 47 compromised men and the deep-pocketed influence of Vincent Gigante. "Peace or war, Captain? It's a simple choice," Bumpy stated, his gaze as cold as the steel girders of the Triborough. He laid out the terms with surgical precision: the immediate and permanent cessation of all fabricated arrests and Gigante-funded harassment in exchange for the safe return of Sullivan and Kowalsski. More importantly, he offered his silence. If the deal was struck, the confessions would remain in a private vault. If not, they would be on the front desks of the FBI and the New York Times by sunset. Morrison looked at the papers, the physical evidence of a scandal that would decapitate his precinct, and realized the criminal across from him now held the only leash on the department's survival. The surrender was silent, written in the captain's sagging shoulders. At dawn on September 19th, the heavy doors of a sedan opened at the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, and Officers Sullivan and Kowalski stumbled out into the cool morning air. They were physically unharmed, but the men who walked back toward the 28th Precinct were ghosts of their former selves. Their swagger was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look that signaled they were effectively neutered. They returned to their beats, but they were no longer hunters. They were captives of their own recorded crimes, forced to walk the streets of Harlem knowing that their careers and their lives hung by the thin thread of Bumpy Johnson's silence. The confessions remained locked away in a private vault, a silent deterrent that ensured the peace treaty was never broken. For the remainder of Bumpy's life, the systemic harassment and the shadow of Vincent Gigante's police-assisted schemes vanished. The documentation proved to be a shield more durable than any vest, providing years of stability in a neighborhood often defined by chaos. It was only after Johnson's death that the truth of those 3 days in September began to leak into the city's lore, a final testament to his enduring legacy: that in the war for Harlem, the man with the facts is more dangerous than the man with the gun.